I stood up and worked the kinks out of my damaged knee, which was still quite sore, the mesquite smell of burning flesh still hanging in the air. Then I looked down at the man lying on the ground. Your boys took off, so when I'm gone, you can make up whatever story you want. Tell them you kicked my ass or chased me off. I don't care. As long as you stay in the point and stop killing people, we'll be fine. Or what? Or you and I are going to have a serious disagreement. Shortly after my job with Vincent Marshall, Samantha stopped returning my calls. It was 2 weeks before I could get her on the phone. When she finally picked up, I received a lecture about my failings as a friend and the nuances of maintaining business relationships. Yesterday, she finally let me take her to dinner, and we agreed never to mix business with pleasure again. The following morning, I stood in her kitchen, my hair still wet from the shower, and sipped a cup of coffee. Her kitchen had sterile white walls adorned only by a single line of pictures in black frames. It was like a timeline that stretched back into the past, documenting Samantha's life with her wife Christine. Samantha and Christine on their honeymoon in the Swiss Alps, celebrating their engagement traipsing through Aztec ruins, reenacting the VJ Day photo of a sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square. A decade of memories preserved in simple black frames. While I was examining the most recent picture, Samantha emerged from her bedroom, eyes half closed, wearing an oversized t-shirt. Before I could say anything, she held up a hand and lurched past me, mumbling the word coffee. After she had poured herself a cup and taken several long sips, she turned to me with a relieved smile and said, "Good morning." I pointed to a picture of her, arm in arm with Christine, leaning on a palm tree. "This one's new. Bahamas? Hawaii. How is Chris doing?" "Good. Stationed in London for 6 months. She sends her regards." "Regards? That's an improvement. Seems like just yesterday she was threatening to kill me." "You're such a drama queen. It was a joke." "She was cleaning her gun at the time." "She's an intelligence analyst." "And she got this by crunching numbers?" I asked, pointing at the picture of Christine receiving the Naval Marksmanship Medal. "Anyway, she calmed down when I convinced her you weren't trying to get the three of us into bed together." "Now there's a frightening thought. You were more than enough." "As it should be," she said with a satisfied smile. I glanced around the kitchen. The pots hung in size order from a rack above the stove. The coffee, tea, and sugar were in apothecary jars evenly spaced on the counter. The pictures formed a perfect line across the wall of the kitchen. "For someone with such a tidy world, you certainly have a complicated marriage." "What's complicated about it?" "Other than the fact that you live in New York, your wife is in London, and I'm drinking coffee in your kitchen after spending the night with you?" She shrugged. I stared at her, the question still on my face. Finally, she said, "Chris likes that I have a career that I'm dedicated to, shares my hatred of Indian food, and she understands that I find a wide range of things sexy. So I don't give her grief about being stationed abroad 6 months out of the year, and she gives me a pass when I have an itch she can't scratch," she said with a wink. "That's the stuff good marriages are made of, not moonlight walks and rose petals. Why the sudden interest in my marriage?" "It's not sudden. I just figured it was none of my business." "And a picture of us in Hawaii changed your mind?" I shrugged. It was a fair question. I never really thought much about our marriage. The lack of caffeine in my system was probably making me maudlin. I sipped my coffee. Samantha walked over, slipped her arm around my waist, and looked at the picture. "It's nice to have someone to come home to at the end of the day." "She's not home very often." "Often enough for me. And we never take our time together for granted. How many couples can say that? You should try it." "Yes, Mom." She slapped the side of my head, then her hand came to rest in the middle of my back. I reached back through the memories of thousands of photos I'd taken over the years, trying to find one that would match the standard issue vacation snapshot. What I found was half-developed and out of focus with undercurrents of pain. "It's hard for me," I finally said. "It's hard for everyone, Ryan. If you don't want it, that's fair. But don't shrug it off just because it's hard." "Any other advice?" She looked me up and down and fiddled with the frayed pocket on my t-shirt. "A trip to Barney's wouldn't kill you." "I really don't know what Christine sees in you." "Oh, get the fuck out of my apartment." Rather than jump on the bus, I decided to walk across town. The vacation photo was still nagging me, and I wanted time to clear my head. I spend most of my life sifting through the broken bits of other people's problems, searching for answers. Usually, I find them tucked in the hip pocket of some dismal neighborhood. That's where I live my life. Most women don't want any part of that. That thought had wound itself so snugly around my brain that I was halfway across Lexington Avenue before I noticed the subtle weight that had begun to build in my shoulders. I stopped on the far corner and looked around. Nothing appeared out of place. The people in the street didn't appear to feel the force that was gently pulling me toward the ground. Rather than waste half the day searching on my own, I decided to ask someone who might know. Service entrances in New York City are usually recessed into buildings so that pedestrians can avoid them when the doors open unexpectedly. These little alcoves also serve as natural traps that catch wind-blown bits of trash, commuters taking shelter from sudden storms, and homeless people begging change off tourists. In one of these niches on 7th Avenue was a guy wearing a hoodie from a fitness club in Jersey and a pair of jeans stained with coffee and street grime. The dark skin of his hands was chapped by long exposure to the elements. He was jingling some change in a Starbucks cup. Maybe 1 in 50 people who passed tossed him a few coins. I stepped up to him and dropped a roll of singles and fives into the cup. It stopped moving. He plucked the cash out of the cup and tucked it into his back pocket, then looked up at me. Nerve damage caused the right side of his face to sag, and there was a vicious scar that crossed from his ear to his chin. He wore his hood up and a baseball cap with the brim pulled down to conceal as much of his face as possible. The unaffected half of his mouth was curved into a smile. "Hey, Ryan, where you been?" "Sorry, Cargo. Been busy," I said as I sat down next to him. "How are you?" "Okay. Back on my meds." "That's good to hear." Cargo shrugged. "They make my hands shake and my brain feels foggy all the time. Without them, everything's clearer. I can remember more. I'm not stuck in the after." Cargo was a soldier in the Iraq War. Since he returned from overseas, his life was divided into the before and the after. He's told me a little bit about the before. From what I can tell, he had some emotional problems prior to enlisting in the Army, but the structure of military life agreed with him. Until the war. Soldiering is about structure. War is about chaos. Chaos didn't agree with Cargo. He can talk a blue streak about field stripping a rifle or how the guys in his platoon played pranks on each other. He never talked about the fighting. Now he rents a room in a house owned by another vet. His disability check covers the rent, and he survives doing odd jobs and begging on the street. When he's taking his medication, he can get by. Without it, not so much. That was life in the after. The after has its advantages. You've got people here. "Yeah, a few." "So you got your money. Where's my package?" Cargo reached into one of the bags he had arranged next to him and pulled out a plastic grocery bag knotted at the top and handed it to me. I undid the knot, reached in, and pulled out a handful of pennies, jumbling them around in my hand. 342 Abe Lincolns. Nothing older than the mid-'80s. Don't know why the hell you want them. They're not good for anything. When was the last time you used a couple hundred pennies to pay for a cup of coffee? I dropped all but one of the pennies back in the bag and held it between my thumb and index finger. "You know what these are made of?" "Copper." "Used to be. But copper got too expensive, so back in '82, the government changed them to zinc, with a thin copper coating on the outside. Zinc is an interesting metal, right down to its atoms. If it sees something that looks good, it'll just give its electrons away. Not like silver or gold, who are saving their precious electrons for somebody special. Zinc is a real whore. That's why they put it on metal buckets and on the hull of steel ships. When those water molecules come along trying to deflower the steel, zinc charms the pants right off them. It's irresistible. Since pennies are made of zinc, they're like little magnets for destructive energy. Always good to have something like that around, just in case.
Sure,
Cargo said in a patronizing tone.
And why do you need so many of them?
I keep leaving them behind.
Mm-hmm. And how do you know about all the elements?
Not all of them, just zinc. I read it somewhere. Cargo nodded. I told him this story 100 times. At first, I kept repeating it because I assumed with all of his problems, he was just having trouble remembering it. But now I think he just enjoys hearing it. It's a little vacation from the after. So what do you hear, Cargo?
A few stock tips I don't trust. They're closing the Brooklyn Bridge to Manhattan-bound traffic for renovations.
Again? Cargo nodded, then looked around self-consciously.
And something's up with the 6 train. My friends on the rails say everyone is cleared out. Only people you find on it now are the zombies,
he said as he nodded to a passing group of people in business suits all staring at their phones while they walked. My eyes drifted away from him as I thought about my ride down from Samantha's neighborhood. He was right. I didn't see any of the usuals. No musicians, no Bible thumpers with bad breath, no homeless people catching a nap. A trip on any subway line is bound to put you in contact with at least one of these characters. Not today. I looked at Cargo again. Anybody talking about why?
No. Just that it's not safe and it gets worse the farther uptown you go.
Clear up to the Bronx? Cargo tilted his head as if to say, "What do you think?" Then pulled his hat down further and looked at the change in his cup. I clapped him on the shoulder as I got up. "It was good talking to you, man. Stay on the meds, okay?"
I got a choice,
he said without looking up. The cup started jingling, and Cargo was back in the after. I walked back across town to the 6 train. Milling around the southeast corner of Times Square was a man holding up a placard with the U.S. Constitution plastered on it. It wavered back and forth over his head as he spoke, and it looked as though he was planning on bringing it down on the head of a passing pedestrian. "You think the government cares about you? You think genetically mutated foods are going to keep you healthy? You think your 401ks and designer smartphones are going to save you? You are nothing but cattle in the government slaughterhouse. You're nothing but ATM machines to the corporations." I recognized him. He was always out on the street, rain or shine, lecturing the masses. But normally he did his thing outside Grand Central. What are you scared of? The main concourse of Grand Central was buzzing with activity. It was the tail end of rush hour, so there was an equal mix of commuters and tourists admiring the architecture. I made my way down the stairs to the 6 train. As soon as I stepped on the platform, I could feel the change, like the anticipation of that first drop of rain when you're standing under a sky of dark clouds without your umbrella. I hopped the next uptown train. With every stop, the weight on my shoulders got slightly stronger until I finally reached Hunts Point Avenue. If something bad was leaking down into Manhattan from the Bronx, it was most likely coming from here. The Point is just like any other bad neighborhood. There are 2 kinds of people. Good people just trying to survive, and bad people abusing anyone who gets in their way. The violence hangs in the air like the smell of rotting garbage on a muggy summer afternoon. The moment I left the subway station, the Point's violence wrapped itself around me like it always did. But the weight in my shoulders also changed. It spread out into my limbs, making me feel like a life-size marionette dragging his strings around behind him. I pulled out my camera and walked east on Hunts Point Avenue. Scanning the street intently, I stopped occasionally to take a picture. Anyone who saw me would mistake me for an amateur shutterbug who was clueless about his surroundings. That suited me fine. I walked around the neighborhood, scoping out the usual spots where the street demons usually gather. It was a remarkably quiet day in the Point. Not calm so much as apprehensive, restless. And every now and then, it felt like someone was tugging on my strings, holding me back or threatening to pull me off balance. Eventually, I came upon the scene of an accident. A section of the sidewalk was closed off with yellow police tape, and there was a body under a blanket. A few feet away was a utility pole that had fallen to the ground. I stayed as close as possible to the police barriers as I passed by the scene, slowing down as I approached the police so that I could hear what the officers were saying.
Anyone see anything? If they did, they aren't sharing. Any luck with her?
The one officer asked, nodding toward a woman kneeling at the edge of the crime scene, clutching her hands to her chest. She seemed to be praying in Spanish, but her words were interrupted by violent sobs that racked her body.
My Spanish isn't very good, but I know she isn't going to be much help until she calms down. She just keeps saying something about the hand of the Lord, or Lord's something. I don't know. Looks like someone plowed into the utility pole, knocked it over, and killed a kid. It was a freak thing for sure, but work of God?
The officer said with a shrug. I looked at the pole as I passed by. No one could have crashed into it with enough force to knock it down without totaling their car. And the wood was splintered out into the street, not like an impact, more like it had been pulled to the ground from the top. I continued up the street, and the invisible strings I dragged behind me got heavier as I went. Eventually, I found 3 Hummers parked in a parking lot of a burned-out restaurant. There was a group of men draped over the trucks talking. As I walked into the lot, I was approached by 2 kids who couldn't have had more than 25 years between them.
You lost?
One of them asked. I shook my head. You the guard dogs? I asked. One of them sprouted a big smile and growled at me. The other asked what I wanted. I want the guy holding your leash, I said, pointing at a man leaning up against one of the cars who was clearly the center of everyone's attention.
Well, why don't you talk to his secretary and set up a meeting?
They burst out laughing. I don't think so. I've got business to discuss, I said, holding my hand in the air, a wad of cash folded into my palm. Their smiles faded, and one of the kids retreated back to the group. There are 2 things that are universally understood on the streets: cash and fear. Cash is easier to carry around. The leader of this little band walked toward me. I knew most of the players in the Point, but I didn't recognize this guy.
The fuck you want?
I just passed a kid laid out on the sidewalk a few blocks away. Was that you? He shrugged. And I hear you've been moving downtown. No one's riding the 6 who doesn't have to. Another shrug. Do you need me to use smaller words? His shoulders tightened up, and he leveled an icy stare at me. He carried himself with an air that went beyond the swagger of the garden variety street thug. Ambition, arrogance, it was hard to tell. But it was definitely his influence that was reaching down into Manhattan. I could feel it tugging the strings weighing me down. Who are you? I asked. He pulled down the collar of his muscle shirt so I could read the tattoo sprawled across his chest. El Puño de Dios. God's jerking off? I said, reading the tattoo. He let the collar snap back into place and his face grew severe. The invisible strings on my limbs snapped tight and wrenched me to the ground in a heap. Everything went dark. Somewhere above me I heard Puño say,
"The fist of God."
The world slowly faded back into view, and with it came the pain. As I lay there, lashed to the ground, my body screamed at me from a dozen different places. My knee had cracked when it hit the pavement, and skewers of pain shot up into my thigh. I was vaguely aware of Puño and his crew laughing over me. I fought back a wave of nausea and involuntarily tried to shake my vision back into focus. Instead, my head ground against the pavement, sending flares of pain into my eyes and scalp. My cheek had been crushed when my face hit the pavement. I took a deep breath, letting the air, laced with hatred and violence, into my lungs. It coursed through my body, pushing my mangled cheek back into shape and closing up the wound. My leg itched as the fragments of my kneecap knitted themselves back together. I let out the breath. Another breath, and I was able to push the pain back another inch. Their voices were retreating back to their cars. Another breath, another inch. I could still hear Punyo talking, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Every moment he and his friends spent chest thumping gave me more time to recover. Another breath, and I could think straight enough to try and get up off the ground. Anger had formed my gut into a tight ball, and it was snaking its way up to my head. I pushed myself off the ground. My right leg still couldn't hold any weight, but I managed to stand. Punyo realized I was up, and he pulled down on my strings again. But I was propped up by the violence coursing through the courtyard. Punyo screamed curses as he stormed back to where I was standing. There was a chorus of shearing metal as the cars parked in the lot flattened when Punyo passed by, like they were toys crushed under the feet of an enormous child having a tantrum. His crew scattered like roaches. I felt around in my mind for the tickling fingers of time and grabbed hold of them. I pulled, stretching out time and freezing him with an angry expression on his face that looked comical in the red light. I lashed his wrists together with some scrap wire I found in a nearby trash can, and I pushed him backward until he was leaning at an insane angle, his head hovering just a few feet off the ground. Then I released time back to itself. Punyo fell and hit the ground with a satisfying thud, his head bouncing off the pavement. Before he could get his bearings, I sat on his chest, pinning him to the ground. His eyes eventually focused, and he growled a stream of curses at me. I put the heel of my boot under his chin and pushed, bending his head to a painful angle. The hatred in the air was racing through my veins now, and I wanted nothing more than to snap his neck. As I inched his chin further back, he said, "I'm gonna kill you." "Maybe," I said, desperately trying to rein in my anger. "But it seems unlikely." I reached down and pulled up the side of his shirt, exposing his ribs. I pressed a penny against one of his ribs, and it seared itself into his skin. His growl turned into a scream. The lid from the metal dumpster ripped free of its hinges and flung itself toward me, but it clattered to the pavement before it could reach me. Punyo's eyes moved to the twisted metal laying on the ground, motionless. Then he shot a look to me. The weight dragging on my limbs lessening with every passing moment. Another dumpster opened, but the lid just flapped, trying to free itself and then falling back into place. Punyo let out an animal-like groan as he tried to thrash his way out from under me. My weight on his chest made it hard for him to breathe, and he couldn't get purchase on the ground. When I stopped pressing the penny into his side, his struggling petered out, and he stared out of the corner of his eye at me. He still had a sneer on his face, but there was a taint of fear in his eyes. I took my boot heel off his chin and glanced at his ribs. "That's going to keep you from doing any more damage for a while. I wouldn't try to take it off if I were you. It's going to fall off in a couple of days and you'll be back to normal. In the meantime, you get to be a normal person for a while." I stood up and worked the kinks out of my damaged knee that was still quite sore, the mesquite smell of burning flesh still hanging in the air. "Your boys took off, so when I'm gone, you can make up any story you want. Tell them you kicked my ass or chased me off. I don't care. As long as you stay in the point and stop killing people, we'll be fine."
Or what?
"Or you and I are going to have a serious disagreement." As I walked away, I heard him scrabbling back to his feet and working his hands out of the bindings. At least he was smart enough not to follow me. There might be hope for him, but I doubt it. I made my way back to the 6 train, brimming with rage. Not starting a full-on battle with Punyo took all of my restraint, and still the violence was leaking out through the cracks in my self-control. I made it to the subway platform without incident and stood looking out over the tracks, ignoring everything around me. When the downtown 6 train stopped at the platform, there was a guy leaning against the door of the nearly empty train car in front of me. The first commandment of commuting in New York City is get out of the way. If you're riding a half-empty subway car, don't block the door. As the doors slid open, I put my shoulder down and gave him a firm shove as I boarded the train.
Watch where you're going!
I turned to face him and just stood there waiting. When he reached up to shove me away, I drove my forehead right into his nose. He stumbled back out of the car, just as the door was closing, separating us. I felt a trickle of blood running down my nose from the cut on my forehead. He slammed his fists against the door of the car, screaming,
I'm gonna find you, motherfucker!
I stood there staring him in the eye. The dark energy coursing through my body started to itch the line of blood on my forehead. As it sealed the cut on my forehead, he stopped shouting and just stared back at me. Still staring him in the eye, I put my finger to my lips and said, "Shh." The energy from the point was like drinking an entire bottle of whiskey. The buzz came relatively quick, and the hangover was murderous. By the time I'd reached Grand Central, most of the energy had leached out of my system. I was exhausted, dizzy, and had a pounding headache. I staggered off the train and grabbed onto a trash can to keep from tumbling face first onto the concrete platform. I stood there, leaning my elbows on the edge of the can, my head in my hands, waiting for the world to stop spinning. A moment later, I was puking into the trash can. When the heaving stopped, I dragged myself up to the main level and bought a large coffee from one of the vendors. At this hour, the building was full of tourists, and I wandered around in the crowd, giving my injuries time to heal. Eventually, I found my way to the information booth in the center of the main concourse. Leaning against it, I pulled out my phone and scanned through my various inboxes. There was an email from Tino begging me to come see him play in the Frozen Embryos reunion show next Friday. Another from Candy thanking me for getting her the job at Marshall Incorporated. And Samantha texted me, inviting me to meet her at her apartment tonight. I stood there for more than an hour, reading and soaking in the energy from the enormous space. I was about to tuck my phone back into my pocket and head home when, on a whim, I looked up Doris's Twitter feed and scrolled through her recent posts. There were tweets about job hunting and achievements posted from gaming websites. Then one came up that I reread 3 times before it registered. "Are you out there, number 7?" it said. "I'm looking for you." I thought about the baseball card from the Marshall job still sitting on my desk back in my apartment. Then I clicked reply. I heard that Mickey Mantle's ghost haunts the Bethesda fountain in Central Park on gloomy Thursdays in October. I put my phone away and jumped on the 6 train back uptown to my apartment. 2 stops later, 4 guys got on the train and started singing for the crowd. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate the Red Shift Chronicles on iTunes. The Red Shift Chronicles is written and performed by Tom Simonson. The show is recorded by Steve Simonson at String Theory Studios. All music for the Red Shift Chronicles is written and performed by Steve Simonson.